Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to today's Price Formation Enhancements Working Group for a discussion regarding market power mitigation. My name is Christina Guimero, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. Next slide, please. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Next slide, please. To ask questions during the meeting, you can open the participant and chat panels on the bottom right. You can then raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon, or if you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. And for everyone joining us today, please state your name and affiliation first before speaking. You may also send comments and questions via chat to all panelists. Next slide, please. This is a visual representation of where we are in the stakeholder process. We're here where the arrow is at the beginning of the proposal development stage. Next slide, please. Today's agenda will include a discussion on CAISO area competitiveness by Scott, followed by a grouping approach discussion by Kuhn before we conclude for the day. So with that, I'll turn it over to James to get us started, and please advance to the next slide.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. This is James Friedrich with the ISO. And I just want to briefly mention that today we are lucky to be joined by Scott and Quinn from the CAISO's market analysis team, who have been working hard on putting together some analysis that we've been preparing for in this working group for quite some time. So the analysis is going to be presented in two parts. First, Scott is going to walk us through a competitiveness assessment of the California ISO from a structural basis, and the idea behind looking at this information was to use this information to help us determine whether it continues to be appropriate to exclude the California ISO balancing area from the BA level tests. And connected with that analysis will be, the second half will be Quinn, who will present on a counterfactual assessment of the grouping approach. And the idea behind this, the second half, is to look at what may be the potential expected change in mitigation frequency in the Western EIM if we were to move from testing in balancing areas individually, as we do today for BA level market power, towards a grouping approach. And so if we have time at the end, we can pause and deliberate on what this analysis means for our BA market power proposals moving forward. And of course, feel free to stop and ask questions as we go along. So to kick things off, I will pass the mic to Scott. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, great. Thanks, James, for that introduction. So I'm going to take us through, to start, a review of the dynamic competitive path assessment, and then we'll look at it in particular for how we apply it to the WEIM BAAs. We'll then look at applying that DCPA logic to the CAISO BAA, and then finally a review of the CAISO competitiveness, and then I'll turn it over to Quinn, who will talk more about her grouping approach analysis. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of pieces to the dynamic competitive path assessment, and we're going to kind of take them one by one, but we're going to start with a high-level overview. So I think in our last meeting, Sylvie gave a great overview of the MPM process kind of as a whole. And the DCPA is just one piece in that MPM process. So the goal of the DCPA is to determine if a given constraint is competitive. So that is the output of the DCPA process. The residual supply index is the final measure, which we use to determine yes, no on competitiveness. If the residual supply index is greater than 1, the constraint is competitive, less than 1, non-competitive. So it's yes or no, and we're going to get much deeper into how we come up with that number. But just for a high-level overview of how the process works, We start by identifying the top 3 companies that have the most potential to impact the flow on a given constraint. These top 3 companies are labeled as the pivotal suppliers or the potentially pivotal suppliers. And then we measure whether there's enough supply from all other resources not part of the pivotal supply to still meet the flow on the constraint. Next slide, please. So the residual supply index is our kind of final piece that determines competitiveness, and it's calculated based on the supply of counterflow and the demand for counterflow. At a high level, the demand for counterflow on a given constraint is the cleared megawatts on the constraint from all participating resources. We'll get into this more in a bit, but when we're talking about the BAA level DCPA, that's all resources within the BAA. So the supply of counterflow is a measure of the supply available on the constraint once we discount withholding from the set of pivotal suppliers. So we calculate the supply of counterflow differently depending on whether or not the resource is owned by a pivotal supplier or a fringe competitive supplier, so not a pivotal supplier. So down at the bottom there, we have the formulation of the calculation for RTPD or for FMM. So for each constraint, we have the RSIs equal to the supply of counterflow from the pivotal suppliers plus the supply of counterflow from all other resources divided by the demand for counterflow. Next slide, please. So now we're going to dig into each piece of that just a little bit deeper to give you a better understanding of each of those pieces. So for each constraint, the top 3 companies, as I noted, the set of potentially pivotal suppliers are identified based on the top 3 companies that have the greatest ability to impact the flow on a given constraint. We call that ability to impact flow on the constraint withheld capacity. And at the resource level, we measure this by taking the maximum amount of energy output that the resource could reach in a given interval, and we subtract it by the minimum amount. So it's the range of kind of output values that the resource could provide, the maximum minus the minimum, and we multiply it by the shift factor. So a shift factor is the amount that a resource impacts a given constraint. So it's per resource per constraint. So if a resource has a 0.5 shift factor and it changes its output by 1 megawatt, the flow on that constraint would then change by half a megawatt. So it's just kind of the amount that the resource's movement impacts the given constraint that we're interested in. So the top 3 companies that own the largest amount of withheld capacity per constraint are labeled as potentially pivotal suppliers. Everyone else is labeled as a fringe competitive supplier. One additional note here, companies that are net buyers of electricity are excluded from being labeled as potentially pivotal on the basis that they would have no incentive to raise prices. So if overall you're buying more power than you're selling, we assume you would not have an incentive to enact market power to raise prices, so we do not include you in the list of potentially pivotal supply. This is a calculation that's done outside the market on a quarterly basis, and then it gets into the market just as a static value for all the companies that are labeled as net buyers. Next slide, please. The demand for counterflow, we calculate it by taking the cleared megawatts on the constraint from all participating resources. So when we're talking about the EIM BAAs, we're talking about all participating resources within the given BAA. And then the resource demand for counterflow contribution to a given constraint is just equal to the shift factor multiplied by the energy output or the energy award. When we're talking about the WEIM BAA DCPA process, set the shift factor equal to -1 for all resources within the BAA being tested. So the shift factor is less important when we're talking about BAA level market power mitigation. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to get into how the supply of counterflow is calculated. So the supply of counterflow, we're talking about the resource level, we calculate it differently for the set of potentially pivotal suppliers and fringe competitive suppliers. So if a resource is owned by a potentially pivotal supplier, we want to treat them as if they're withholding all the capacity that they can on the constraint. So we do that by looking at the lowest megawatt level they could reach in the study interval. So we're essentially taking the set of potentially pivotal suppliers, and we're looking at if we ramp all their resources down as fast as we can, that megawatt level that we're left with is going to be the supply of counterflow from the potentially pivotal suppliers. For fringe competitive suppliers, it's the opposite. So we're looking at the highest megawatt level they can ramp to in the study interval. So if you're potentially pivotal, we're looking at you withholding supply. And then if you are a fringe competitive supplier, we're looking at whether you can ramp up to meet the kind of void from the potentially pivotal suppliers. Next slide, please. So again, this is the same calculations. The fringe competitive supply is equal to the maximum megawatt level a resource can reach times the shift factor. When we're talking about BAA, DCPA, shift factor is always going to be equal to -1. If a resource is offline and it has a startup time of less than 15 minutes, it can still provide fringe competitive supply. If it has a startup time greater than 15 minutes, and again, this is particular to FMM market, where it is a 15-minute market. If the startup time is greater than 15 minutes and the resource is offline, it does not provide any fringe competitive supply. For potentially pivotal suppliers, we're looking at the minimum megawatt level the resource can reach times the shift factor. We do not consider shutdown, so limited by the P-min. This is a bit of a simplified version of the exact calculation, but if you want more details, I would refer you to Market Operations BPM Appendix B. But this should give you the high-level sense of what we're talking about here for supply of counterflow. Next slide, please. So in the MPM process, constraints are only evaluated in the DCPA when they are binding. And for WEIM BAAs, we only trigger the DCPA when there is positive price separation between the BAA and the rest of the system. So this means that that BAA's price is higher than the rest of the system. And then we test for competitiveness within that BAA when we see that the price is higher in that BAA than the rest of the system. So most often this is caused by WEIM transfer constraints or individual EIM transfer system resources or ETSRs binding in the import direction. This often happens when we have a BA that fails the flex test or the bid range capacity test in the up direction, as this limits the EIM transfers in the import direction, which then often, if those transfers are binding, triggers the DCPA calculation for that BAA. So once that trigger happens, the BAA as a whole is then evaluated for competitiveness by applying the logic of the DCPA to the participating resources within that BAA. Next slide, please. So this is what that calculation looks like for the WEIM BAAs. So we're talking about all the participating resources within the BAA and their shift factors equal to -1 because we're all within that BAA. Any movement on a resource within that BAA is going to contribute an equal amount to the total amount of energy in that BAA. So the shift factor is equal to 1. And then we have the same RSI calculation that we have for a normal flow gate or for a normal constraint. The supply of counterflow from potentially pivotal suppliers is the sum of supply of counterflow from resources in the BAA that belong to potentially pivotal suppliers. So the minimum megawatt levels for the potentially pivotal suppliers, and then the supply of counterflow from fringe competitive suppliers is just the sum of supply of counterflow from resources in the BAA that belong to the set of fringe competitive suppliers, or the maximum megawatt level that they can reach. A lot of BAAs just have one company that owns the majority of the resources in that BAA, or all of them. So you might not even have any fringe competitive supply when we're looking at the fringe competitive supply at the BAA level. If you have less than 3 companies, you're just going to have potentially pivotal suppliers. Finally, the demand for counterflow that we're talking about here is the sum of the cleared energy on all the participating resources within that BAA. So it's the same logic that we apply to other constraints, and this is how we look at it at the WEIM BAA level. Next slide, please. So the CAISO BAA is currently not evaluated using this same criteria that we use for all of the other BAAs. However, the DCPA is used to test constraints within CAISO for competitiveness as part of the normal market power mitigation process. So anytime a constraint binds within CAISO, this MPM process runs, and the binding constraint gets evaluated using the DCPA to determine if that constraint is competitive. The reason we don't apply the same...
We do have a hand raised by Callie Wells whenever you want to take a moment.
Okay, thanks. I think I might take questions at the end once I get through the material.
Perfect, thanks.
So the reason we don't apply the same process to the CAISO is due to a kind of an underlying assumption that the CAISO is structurally competitive. This is due kind of to historical reasons and the competitiveness metrics that are compiled by DMM, I think on as part of their annual report. So that competitiveness analysis is available. It does focus on the day-ahead results, and the DCPA calculations are slightly different in day-ahead versus those in FMM. Next slide, please. So for the purposes of this analysis, we took the same DCPA logic and we applied it to CAISO in the way that we would apply it to other WEIM BAAs today. This test was performed for intervals in which the CAISO area was import constrained to mimic the existing logic applicable to other BAAs. The kind of upshot of the analysis is that there were no intervals in 2024 when CAISO would be non-competitive based on the existing logic. Next slide, please. So when we look at intervals where the CAISO WEIM transfer constraints are binding, we see only 3 FMM intervals in 2024. These were due to a system issue in the morning of August 29th, when all resources, or excuse me, all WEIM BAAs transfers were limited due to a market connectivity issue. So when we look at the calculated RSI for CAISO based on the DCPA test, we see that it's above 1 in all of the intervals where we have the CAISO WEIM transfer constraints binding in the import direction. So in all 3 of these cases, CAISO would have been competitive. CAISO did fail the RSC test in 1 interval in 2024 on July 23rd. However, the EIM transfers were not binding in the import direction during this failure, so would not have had triggered the DCPA calculation. So that's the end of my slides. Callie, happy to take your question and questions from anyone else before I turn it over to Quinn.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wills with WPTF. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you so much for doing this analysis. We've been looking forward to these results for quite some time. And also kind of laying out the whole at a high level, how the DCPA works and all the different components. I know it's a lot to put together. And you mentioned it's kind of a small piece in the overall market power mitigation process, but I think it's a really important piece. So I really appreciate you walking us through that. Couple quick questions. So first one though, you mentioned earlier that for a lot of the EIM BAAs, they have less than 3 companies within it. So anytime you guys do the calculation, you don't really have fringe suppliers left over, which means they would obviously fail that test. Do you know how many, and maybe, you know, off the top of your head, how many BAs that is the case for?
I do not know. Anyone else on the call? I take a stab at that.
This is James. I'm not sure either.
Okay, that's okay. You just mentioned that, and so the natural question was, well, how many does that apply to? Okay, no worries on that one. So the other one is back on, I think, slide 9. You don't have to go back to that slide if you don't want to. You mentioned that when you're doing the DCPA, the CAISO will identify net buyers, and those net buyers are excluded from being potentially pivotal suppliers. But I thought for EIM BAAs, that's not the case, that they don't actually exclude net buyers from being pivotal. Is that still the case, or has the CAISO changed that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And might have to take that one back unless anyone else wants to tackle it.
Okay, yeah, no worries. But yeah, if you guys can confirm, because I thought there was that slight distinction between how it's applied for CAISO versus EIM BAAs, but couldn't recall. Okay, and then the last question I have is, when you were talking about counterflow, the demand for counterflow on the constraints, the way I understand that is essentially if you have a constraint with a 100 megawatt limit, you can have 150 megawatts flowing one direction and in the direction of the congestion, and 50 megawatts flowing in the opposite direction of the congestion. And the demand for counterflow is that 50 megawatts flowing in the opposite direction. And that's why you guys use the shift factors and all that stuff to essentially calculate that 50 megawatts on the demand side. But when you're talking about how it's applied to the EIM, I think you made kind of a distinction there, and I think it's a really important one, that it's not necessarily the 50 megawatts flowing in the opposite direction, but it's just more of the total scheduled generation in that BAA, which includes all the generation to support demand in that BAA plus the transfers out. Did I understand that distinction?
Yeah, we're talking about all cleared megawatts on participating resources within the BAA. So if some of it was being exported, yeah, that would be still included in that DCF.
Okay, so it's slightly different. The demand for, so it's not really a demand for counterflow to the binding constraint. It's really just the total generation in that BAA is being considered the demand.
From participating resources, I think, then yes, I think it's sounded accurate. I would have to fully think through it, but.
Okay, nope, thank you so much for answering those. And again, thanks for laying all that out in this analysis.
Sure.
Next in the queue, we have JK.
Good afternoon, Scott. This is JK Wang from PG&E. I find slide 16 or 17 is very interesting. I apologize if this is an easy question. For the KISO EIM transfer constraint, is there only one or there are multiple?
Could you say that one more time? Sorry.
Yeah, is there only one KISO WEM transfer constraints in the formulation, or there are actually multiple constraints? And when you're testing, all of those constraints are binding in their import direction.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have the overall WEIM transfer constraint limit, and then we also have individual EIM transfer system resources, or ETSRs. So I believe that this was done based on the WEIM transfer constraint or EIM ETSRs, or just ETSRs.
So there's only one overall constraints we're checking when run this test. It was binding, and that was used as a triggering condition for doing the 3 pivotal test.
Yep.
Okay. And I guess this is I understand a reason for doing that, but just want to point out we use the triggering condition here is as a constraint binding, or in actuality, when we test the other BAs, it is based on the price separation, which is the shadow price of the power balance constraint of the other BAs. Is that correct?
Yeah, that sounds roughly correct to me.
Okay. And finally, when I read these slides, are we drawing the conclusion that KISO is likely to be competitive all the time?
Yeah, I think that's a bigger question. Not sure if anyone else on the call is interested in chiming in there.
Yeah, this is James. I can chime in a bit. And I want to reflect a little on JK's earlier question, where you're correct, JK, that the triggering condition for BA market power broadly is not necessarily an import transfer constraint binding, but price separation. And the easiest way to think about the difference there is that you can be price separated from the broader market, even though the import constraint, the transfer constraint is not on your border. And so that could mean that a transfer constraint on a path somewhere from the general market to you is constraining you from receiving import supply from the broader market, even though the actual import constraint's not directly on your border. So so you're correct about that. The tricky thing here is that KISO in the current methodology is the reference for testing. And so in order to try to assess how often KISO would pass the existing BA level tests, it makes it a little awkward just because the KISO's own price is the reference. And so you kind of would have to truly unwind that assumption to say KISO's price is no longer the reference price for testing. But then in order to do that, you'd have to say, well, what would be the reference price for testing? And so so the easiest way for us to estimate, how often the KISO would fail is to say, okay, well, let's just think about when it's import constrained, is it competitive or not? And acknowledging that it's not going to be perfectly one-to-one comparison, because we would have to figure out as a policy what would be the reference price to determine when the KISO should be tested if it's not the import constraint. Does that help?
Yeah, I appreciate the explanation, especially when you mentioned there may be other constraint binding, preventing the access of cheaper energy, and that's why I use the price separation. I think this is really helpful. And a follow-up on that, I have a very quick question. So the KISO's BAA, KISO's BAA's MAG is the same as the SMAG. I understand that. and also to my understanding, it is possible for a BA to have a lower price than the reference MAC. Is that right? Or are we saying the KAISO's MAC is always the lowest one? The shadow price will always be positive.
So in the EIM today, the shadow price of KAISO's power balance constraint is the reference for testing the rest of the BAs in the EIM, where if another EIM BA has a higher shadow price or MEC for its BA than the KAISO's, then it's tested. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Sorry, yeah, I guess I wasn't clear. So is the KAISO's price always the lowest, or it is possible the other BAs could have a negative shadow price, so that it makes their MAC is lower than the KAISO's? I
see. Yeah. So no, it's not guaranteed that KAISO will be the lowest. In fact, KAISO could potentially be the highest in the EIM, and that's why again it's a little bit square peg in a round hole here, because again, if the KAISO sets the competitive reference price, yet the KAISO is the highest price, right, then no BAs are tested, and so we're not perfectly able to estimate how often the KAISO would fail because of that assumption, because we would have to figure out a new trigger, right, that would not have the KAISO's price as the reference, right? And so keep in mind that in the grouping approach, that we presented in the algorithm in November, if you were to exclude the KAISO, the assumption that the KAISO is always competitive, there's a process with which the algorithm computes a competitive LMP without using the KAISO as a reference. And so when we switch over to Quinn's presentation, we can think about, if the KAISO's reference, or if the KAISO was not assumed to be competitive all the time, perhaps you would be testing it more than the 3 times here on the screen, because there are other conditions that trigger its testing, and they may be uncompetitive. The KAISO may be uncompetitive in those times.
Okay, yeah, that very well answered my question. Thank you so much, James and Scott. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for those questions.
I'm not seeing any further questions in the queue at this moment.
Okay, great. Then I'll turn it over to Quinn to walk us through the grouping approach.
Thank you, Scott. Hi, this is Quinn from Market Performance and Advanced Analytics. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So in this section, we'll discuss the grouping approach and share the results of our impact analysis. In the previous meetings, we have reviewed the concepts and details of the different approaches. I'm not planning to go into those details today. But at a high level, our current approach tests each BAA individually and ignores the supply contributions from other BAAs. This may lead to excess mitigation. Or then on the other side, a grouping approach evaluates BAAs in subsets. It potentially reduces unnecessary mitigation and more accurately reflects the actual market conditions and competitiveness. Next slide, please. We start with an illustrative example. I took this data point from July 24, 2024, RNA 15, middle of the afternoon, FMM binding interval 1. So on the right, we're looking at a BAA connectivity map. If there is a non-base ETSRs defined between 2 BAs, it appears here as a link, showing that the 2 BAs are directly connected. This is a term used in the grouping approach. Since the ETSRs are defining pairs, the graph is undirected, meaning the connections do not have a direction. And layout of the BAAs loosely illustrates the geographic regions So we can see that Pacific Northwest position in upper left, Central Mountain in the upper right, California, bottom left, and Southwest in the bottom right. This structure helps to provide a visual reference for understanding the BA interactions and group formation later on. Okay, so with this data point, the snapshot of the market, the original results being we have a set of BAs marked as non-competitive. Basically, the list is on the left is basically all the BAs above the red line, and another set of BAs marked as competitive. That's everyone below the red line. Next slide, please. So yeah, going through the grouping approach, we start by taking the MEC or marginal energy components by BAA, sort them in descending order, and partition the BAs into the groups. Here we were looking at 4 groups. Start by group 1 marked as red, that's BCHA at $40. Group 2 at $24.76. All the BAs marked in blue. That's group 2. Group 3 was everyone in green at $10.94. Group 4 is everyone in purple. That's $10 at $10.32. Next slide, please. So after that, we start the grouping approach. Start by taking the highest MEC group, that's group 1, test it, it fails, we mark BCHA non-competitive. We go to the next group, because group 1 BCHA is connected to some of the BAAs in group 2, is considered as directly connected. So we test everyone in group 1 and 2 together. The test fails again. We mark BAAs in group 2 as non-competitive as well. Next slide, please. Then we went to group 3. Since they're directly connected again, we test BAAs in group 1, 2, and 3 all together. The test passed this time. We marked the green nodes, the BAAs marked in green group 3, BAAs as competitive, and generated at $10.94 competitive LMP for BAAs in group 1 and 2. If you remember from 2 slides back, we said that all the BAAs above the line, group 1, 2, and 3, were marked uncompetitive from original data set. And now with the grouping approach, by the 3rd step, because we joined the group 3 BAAs with a broader team, the grouping approach marked them as competitive. Then we go to the next step, that's the last step, group 4. We join all of the BAAs together, it passes together, then we mark BAAs in group 4 as competitive. That's the end of the grouping algorithm. Next slide, please. Okay, before I go into the counterfactual study results, any questions?
We have a hand raised by Callie Wells.
Sure.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Do you mind going back 1 slide? Because I think your conversation with JK sparked a couple questions, and we have numbers here, so it might be easier to ask my question with numbers. So I'm trying to understand what causes the price separation or the price differences between these groups, which I know is the MEC. So in, let's say, group 4 is 1032 and group 1 is 40. So obviously, I believe, yeah, Kaisa is in group 4, so let's assume that's the competitive MEC, which means that group 1 has a shadow price on it that's causing its price to be higher than the KISO. Is the price difference between the 40 and the 1032 the shadow prices of the binding transfer constraints somewhere on the system that's separating those 2 groups?
Right. So in the current market results, we we categorize the transfer constraint as part of the congestion component. Here for this example and for this study, we took that component from the congestion component and added back to the energy cost. So these numbers are generated from the process. That's the implied margin energy component on the BA level. So we added those back.
Okay, so that does that. So BCHA's, its individual power balance constraint shadow price is the difference between group 4 and group 1's prices I'm seeing here. And that shadow price is reflecting some transfer constraint binding on the system.
Yes, and mostly import constraint, yes.
Yes, sorry, right, it's higher, import constraint into that. Okay, I really appreciate that clarification because yeah, I think I understand that you might not, one BA might have a higher price, even though it by itself might not be import constraint, but it's connected to another BA that is, and that's why they both have a higher price. My other question in this grouping approach, can you remind me at some point in time we had talked about how individually a BAA might test competitive, but when you add it to a group, it ends up testing uncompetitive because it's added with other BAs that are more uncompetitive than what it is. Is that still the case in this design, or where I can't remember where that conversation ended, if each BA will be tested individually first?
In the grouping approach, we would not start by testing everyone individually. We'll just go by the group definitions, and yes, that could happen. And in one of the later slides, we will show the frequency that happened with this counterfactual study.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
All right, perfect. Let's move on to the next slide, please. All right, so after that example, let's look at some numbers. We did this counterfactual study to evaluate the impact of grouping approach. And start by taking the data. We decided to take summer 2024 data, July through end of September. And it was from FMN market, LMPM pass, finding results. And two assumptions we made for this analysis. One is that we used the master file register ETSR mapping as the reference for connectivity among BAAs, like what I illustrated in the example. And another one is that we consider the competitive LMP of the passing group is set by the lowest MEC in the group. So that's the assumptions and factors. Now we can look at some numbers. Next slide, please. We start by looking at the overall pass rate. A BA is considered as pass in the statistics if it is not import transfer constraint or it passed the RSI test. So this chart shows the number of BAs on the y-axis grouped into bins of pass rate percentages in x-axis with the original results from the cases. So in the study period, we're looking at 15 WM BAAs had pass rate of 95% or higher. That's the tallest bar on the right. And 17 BAAs had pass rates 85% or higher. Next slide, please. Here is the updated results with the grouping approach. The number of BAAs at 95% or higher remained the same at 15, while the number of BAAs at 85% or higher increased to 21. You may notice that there is one BAA at the 40% bucket. That's PowerX BAA. It failed that test about 60% of the time. due to its imposed transfer limits, so that its import transfers were binding frequently. So that's what happened back then. Next slide, please. Here is a table summary. This table summarizes the results at the BA level, and we can read the columns. It includes the first column as BA mean, then the pass rate original means the percentage of pass in the original approach. Then pass rate mu, it's the percentage of pass with the grouping approach. Then pass rate delta, that's the delta change, the absolute delta change between the two approaches. So that's column pass rate mu minus pass rate original gives us pass rate delta. And finally, there is the pass rate given fail. It's a conditional probability, conditional rate. It's the percentage of previously failed BA tests that passed under the grouping approach. If you look at the table numbers a little closely, we see that overall pass rate maintained or increased on the BA level under the grouping approach. So that's pass rate delta column. We see that all the deltas are non-negative to a percentage, right? And if we look at the final column on the right, in some cases, previously failed BA tests showed significant increase in pass rate. So we saw some numbers up to 50, 60% for certain BAs. Yeah, that's the first table. Then on the right, we have a transition table from before to after. So the before is the original case results. To the after is the new results under grouping approach. We can see the status movement between the two approaches. We saw that 91% of the cases, the pass status remained as pass. 7.3% of the cases, a fail remained as fail. Then 1.56, 1.6% of the cases, it was fail in the original data, and then it passed under the grouping approach. And there were less than 0.1% of the cases where it was a pass in the original data and failed in the grouping approach. So that answers the question before. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the heat map. Using the same data, it visualizes the pass rate patterns at the BAA level over hours of the day. Now, on the y-axis, we have the BAA names. On the x-axis, it's hours 1 through 24. And the colors indicate the pass rate. The pass rate legend is on the right. We saw that red is 0% to pink at 25%, to yellow is 50%, to blue is 75%, to 100% as white. So if a cell has a really light color to whitish color, then a BA either pass all the time or not import constraint at that hour in the study period. And we saw that original pass rates by BA, the mainly failed time periods showed up in the midday hours, and that's when the BAs are import constrained more. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the updated results with the grouping approach. We can see that majority of the midday hours, well, there is a small error up. I don't know if it's visible. A small error up means the pass rate went up for that BAA in that hour. So we saw that with the grouping approach, pass rate went up for majority of the midday hours, and especially for Central Mountain areas, regions, and Pacific Northwest regions. Next slide, please. We're looking at the box plot. It shows the number of groups formed over time through the study period. So after talking about the pass rates, now we want to look at the group formation. The y-axis has the number of MEC groups formed from the original data. The x-axis has hours 1 through 24. Each box plot is the distribution of the number of groups formed for that hour. And we can see that majority of the time, all the BA MECs fall into either 2 or 3 groups. In certain hours of the day, mainly the morning peak hours and also hour ending 20, the number goes up to 4, but still in the low range. There are 2 outliers standing out. That's hour ending 4 at 20 and 21. It was due to the same system issue Scott was talking about. So at that time, the BA participants lost connections to Market X, and after that, all the ETSRs went to 0 megawatt due to the system issues. That's why we had the separations amongst almost all BAs, and that was just an outlier. Next slide, please. Here we're looking at the delta prices. So when we said that when a group passes, we generate a competitive LMP based on the lowest MEC in a group. And if there's any unmarked, uncompetitive BAAs in that group, this competitive LMP will be signed to that BAA. And this chart shows the price delta, how far the original MEC is from the competitive LMP for all the BAAs under the grouping approach. Since it was calculated for everyone, either passed or failed, majority of the time, competitive LMPs are the original MECs, meaning they didn't fail the test, it's the same price anyways. So we saw that the large areas are all grays. Those are $0 differences. And we have a smaller set of $0 to $5 differences, $5 to $20 differences, $20 to $50 differences, and a little bit of $50 and above dollar differences. That's how much price delta we were looking at. Next slide, please. To have a better visual of how the price deltas look like for the failed BAAs, we took them out. This is the same chart filtering out the BAA that originally failed the test. And we look at how far their MECs are to the competitive LMPs, and this is the delta buckets. We saw that the delta differences between MEC and competitive LMP tends to be smaller in midday hours and larger during afternoon peak hours. I noticed that there's some areas of $0 difference in there. That just means originally the BA test failed, but they passed in the grouping approach. So the competitive LMP for them is the same as the original MEC. Next slide, please. All right. Now we're looking at what's called the group stability. We wanted to measure the group formation, how stable the group formations are. So this heat map illustrates the group stability by showing how frequently each BAA appeared in each different group rankings over time. Let me explain that. So we start by grouping MECs in descending order. We say the group 1 represents the highest MEC group, and group 2 being the second highest MEC group, etc. Then the frequency of a BA being part of a group shows the statistics on its MEC's relative position in the WEIM fleet. On this chart, the x-axis represents the group ranking. So we have 1 through 2021-ish from the previous box plot. And then on the y-axis is the BAA names. And the color intensity on the right is frequency of BAA in the group ranking. A darker color means it shows up there more frequently. From this chart, we see that the BCHA was consistently assigned to group 1, while the rest BAAs were primarily in group 2 and 3. That align with the number of groups we saw just now, because we were talking about 2 to 3 groups most of the time, up to 4. So you can see that from here as well. And this pattern suggests a fairly consistent group formation with modest variability through this time. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. So here is a heat map represents the co-occurrences for pairwise BAAs in the same MEC group for this study period. So we have the x-axis as BA names, same for the y-axis. Both axes have the list of names. And for pair of the BAAs, that cell, each cell, shows how frequently a pair of BAAs were grouped together. A darker color indicates that higher co-occurrences, and this means that these BAAs were often in the same MEC group. A lighter color means they don't show up in the same group at all, or very rarely. Then we observed that certain BA pairs were consistently grouped together, while the others rarely co-occur. And this pattern suggests the underlying structural relationships in the network and the pricing dynamics in general. And we sort these BA names sort of by region, loosely by region. So you see the square colors show up on this chart, and it's symmetrical. So that's the results from this chart. And that's the end of my part. Any questions?
We have one hand raised by JK.
All right.
Good afternoon, Quinn. This is JK Wang from PG&E. I really like your charts. They are very helpful in visualizing the results. I have a question on page 32 of your slides. That's the previous page, I believe. Yes. So can you please, my apologies if you have already done that. Can you please explain what is the MAC group ranking, why there are 20?
Oh yeah, so let me say that again. So in the grouping approach, we start by ranking, we start by taking the distinct marginal energy component and sort them in descending order. So group 1 means that's the highest MEC group, and group 2 means that's the second highest MEC group. It's the same numbering system as we saw in the example. Remember, we had 4 groups, and group 1 was the highest price. The second group 2 was the second highest price, and so on.
Okay, I thought you mentioned that there were generally falls into either 2 or 3 groups, but I'm a little surprised we can actually see there are 20 groups sometimes exist. In what occasion we'll have like all the BAs have separate prices? It seems like I'm just very curious why we could have like 20 different MAC prices exist at the same time.
Yeah, so that was the outlier point I was talking about on the box plot slide, where we were looking at number of BA MEC groups formed, and there were like 2 dots high up, aside from everyone else. That was a system issue. So I think it was just 2 intervals in RNA 4 on August 29, 2024. And it was an incident where all the WEI and BAAs lost connectivity to all market apps. So the data was not updating, and base schedule run kept failing, and market was failing. And those data points were right after the system issue, when everything started to come back. Because the base schedule failed, ETSRs went to 0 megawatts. That's basically taking out all the transfers. That's where we saw the 2021 groups formed with all the energy components separated for each BAA. But it's an extreme case from a rare incident.
In that case, I may take this too far, but I'm just curious, like in that case, do you consider the grouping approach still applicable, or this is, just some system problem we should just not look at it, not considering the applicability of the grouping approach?
Yeah, I guess it's fair to say it's extreme, rare case and outlier from the rest of the data. I included it anyways because we had the results there, but yeah, I guess it's a little confusing when it shows up aside from everyone else.
Okay, so like in your slides 29, when you have all BA MAC falls into either majority of time falls into either 2 or 3 groups. I guess that when you made that statement, that really alleviates my concern of the computational complexity. But we also say there are actually cases that could be multiple groups. When you run the simulation, could you please share some insights whether that will lead to actual long time of evaluation, or that's pretty easy to be handled?
I can't comment on the performances of the actual system in the future, because for this counterfactual study, I built a prototype in-house, and we have established data. So I utilize the existing data for certain steps. And in the actual system, theoretically, if we have more groups formed, potentially we will be looking at more iterations within the grouping approach, and that will definitely impact the performances. But yeah, it's not comparable. A study, counterfactual study, prototype kind of thing is not comparable to the actual system.
Okay, I understand. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Next, we have a hand raised by Callie.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. First of all, I'll echo JK's appreciation for this analysis. Very thorough, and I really appreciate you putting together all these charts. Couple questions, but first, actually, that conversation with JK about those extreme outlier events, I want to make a connection there. I think you recalled the date as August 29th, 2024, when that system event happened. And those happened to be the only dates that the CAISO, in that analysis, that the CAISO had to be tested for their EIM transfer constraint binding on slide 16. So am I correct in saying that those 3 times the CAISO was EIM transfer constraint where they had that binding was because of the system issue?
It's definitely related. I guess, Scott, you can comment on your part. Yeah, the results from his part, I think we saw that majority of the time CAISO was competitive. That's the take I got from that part.
Yeah, I got that takeaway too. I guess I was just pointing out that the hours, the date and hour that the CAISO was import constrained on their EIM transfer that's represented in the slide, even though they were tested to be competitive, those happen to also be the only time, or it happened to be the same hours that you mentioned for this system event, which was an extreme rare condition. So it's interesting that the only time the KYSA would have possibly been tested happens to also be a very rare extreme event. So I just wanted to make sure, I think those are the same dates and hours you mentioned.
Yes,
I
that's
just wanted to make that connection. Okay. And then my quick two, I guess, more of a question and an ask. On all of these metrics that you have in your section related to the pass rate, I think you said kind of at the very beginning that BA was considered in passing the test, even if they didn't have a MEC higher than the KYSA, so they weren't even needed to be tested. So I'm wondering if you happen to have this data that only the same metrics, but only focuses in on the intervals where the BAs were actually tested. So we can really see, okay, you know, in these 10 hours this BA was tested, it failed the test 8 times or 2 times. Because I think when we include all the intervals, even the intervals where they're not tested at all, I think it kind of masks maybe some of the underlying over mitigation concerns that we're trying to address here.
Yes, I think we can do that as a follow-up. We can do the filter and generate another conditional pass rate based on the MEC condition, the transfer constraint being binding condition.
Okay, yeah, no, that would be great. And that actually, I guess my ask that I have is I think this is a lot of really good information, and I think there's been a couple extra data asks here. And I know the KYSA has presented some data earlier on in this this working group process. So I was wondering if the KYSA would be open to having another meeting to kind of allow the additional analysis to be presented and for participants to kind of gather their thoughts on this and have kind of one more meeting to discuss this BA level market power mitigation. Because it looks like on your guys' initiative page, this is the last meeting before the straw proposal on this specific topic. I think that's maybe more of a question for James.
Right, I was going to ask him. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, happy to, and it's a good question. So we are sort of scrambling to make sure that we can, you know, we have to create a balance between giving stakeholders ample opportunity to anticipate what topics will be discussed on what dates, with also the reality and the reflection of, like, sometimes things happen like this where, you know, we would rather talk about one thing or another. And so, yeah, let us reshuffle or just regroup and think about how we want to reallocate the meetings moving forward, because I do agree that there's some value in some extensions here, if possible. And I also want to point out that it is our plan as of right now, although I don't think a formal agenda is out, that we were planning to discuss BA level market power mitigation at the next Market Surveillance Committee meeting. And so sometimes those are nice venues to which we can you know, extend some analysis and have that discussion with the Market Surveillance Committee without taking up a you know, a price formation meeting. So it is possible that we may use that as a venue for some of this extension, because I'm sure the MSC will themselves have some questions about what we're doing here. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. And I appreciate you guys giving it some more thought. And again, just thank you guys so much for all the analysis you guys put together on this one. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Robert.
Hi, this is Robert Fisher with NV Energy. I just want to ask a quick question based on some questions Kyle was asking. When you said KYSA was not import limited when it did fail the test, is that both FMM and RTD, or is it just RTD?
We only looked at RTPD or FMM, sorry, not RTD.
Okay, and in FMM it was not import limited.
Right.
Question mark. Okay, cool. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thanks, Robert.
And I'm not seeing any other questions. did anyone else want to say any final thoughts before I move on to closing?
Can I just confirm Robert's last comment, because I thought I heard him say the opposite of what he may have meant, but I heard him say the CAISO was import constrained on those 3 days and did not would not have failed the test. Of course, CAISO wasn't tested because that's not the policy. So I just wanted to confirm that I heard that right and make sure that that's clear. So CAISO was import constrained in those 3 RTPD intervals and would not have failed if it were tested, is the conclusion. Is that right, Scott?
Right. I heard Robert's question asking if we were import constrained on our EIM transfers when we failed the test in that one interval that's noted on the slide.
Oh, okay. I had the wrong failing a test terminology. So Robert is referring to the failing the RSE.
Right.
Okay. Sorry about that.
I believe, Robert,
That
you
makes
can
sense.
correct me if I misquoted you.
Great. Well, I guess we'll move on to slide. Perfect. Thank you. And I'm just taking one final glance, not seeing any other questions coming in, so I'll move on to closing the call. Just a reminder to everyone that all meeting materials and notices are available on the initiative webpage. And if at any point you have any additional follow-up questions or any questions that come up, you can always reach out to us at isostakeholderaffairs@caiso.com. Next slide, please. And just a quick announcement before we wrap up. For insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can always subscribe. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's discussion. We thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.